In the first part of this video, we looked at attitudes to teaching reading in both the audiolingual and the early communicative approach. And we saw that there was a radical difference. The audiolingual method trying to, as it were, protect the student from the language by ensuring that the reading text which the students encountered only contained language which they could cope with at whatever level they were currently at. Whereas the communicative approach, throwing them in at the deep end, as it were, using authentic materials right from the beginning of language learning, attempting to teach students to cope and to focus on what they could understand, however little that might be, of the text, rather than what they couldn't understand. I think more recently we've been rethinking that approach slightly. First of all, I think we need to ask ourselves whether our students do actually need to come into contact with authentic text outside the classroom. Now, for some of them, the answer may well be yes. Students studying on an English for Academic Purposes course obviously are going to need to read textbooks in English and so on. So fine. For those types of students, we do need to make sure they can deal with the authentic texts at whatever stage of language learning they're currently at. However, if you take a group of adult general purpose learners, very often they don't have any actual needs to read in English. They may have wants, but that's a slightly different thing. And if you ask those learners what it is that they want to read, they're very unlikely to reply authentic materials or whatever. They're much more likely to say something I can understand, something that will help me improve my English. Because for learners, for the average language learner, the really authentic purpose for reading in English is very often simply to improve their knowledge of the language. So it may well be that we actually have students who don't really want to read in English at all. What they actually want to do is to look at texts and to read those texts in order to consolidate their knowledge of lexis, vocabulary, the language in general. Now, in that case, what type of text is going to be most useful for them? Authentic texts do obviously have advantages. They contain real examples of language use, and obviously at a certain level they may be very, very motivating. However, I would argue that at a lower level, especially for extensive reading outside the classroom, they can equally well be demotivating. What students tend to see is just masses of text which they don't actually understand. Even in the classroom, I'll come back to this idea that however often we may say you don't need to understand every word, if you can do the task, that's enough. I'm not convinced that students always accept it. I think for lower level students, authentic text can be extremely frustrating because they want to know what it all means and they quite clearly can't. Similarly, authentic text can, for lower level students, have the opposite effect to what we actually intend, in that it pushes them back to word by word decoding, bottom up processing, rather than the top down processing which we would really like to be encouraging, or at least a merge of the two. With a difficult authentic text, lower level learners often just can't come to grips with it at all unless they go through it with a dictionary word by word. So, should we go back and look again at simplified texts, or texts specifically written for language learners? Simplified texts, particularly graded readers, have often been criticised for being bland and uninteresting, and obviously some of them are. But as Day and Bamford point out, any type of text can be badly written or well written, and that's true of authentic text just as much as simplified text. And now I think on the market there are actually some very good simplified readers, graded readers, and text can be written to be at the student's level of competence, but to still retain natural discourse patterns and to be interesting. Well, I don't think that any publishers have yet accepted Diane Bamford's plea for steamy eroticism to be injected into graded readers as into the bestsellers, books on the bestseller list. I do think that there are some on the market which are worth picking up and reading. So how can these texts be used? Day and Bamford advocate that the students should do a lot of extensive reading outside the classroom, possibly. And for this, they suggest that the texts need to be at a slightly lower level than the student's current competence, or the I-1 level. In this way, the students are constantly coming across lexis, structures and so on that they've already met in their language learning, but they're coming across them in new contexts. Just as a native speaker continually comes across old lexis in new contexts and gradually builds up a knowledge of how that lexis, how the structures and so on are actually used. However, I think there is also another possibility, and that is of using texts at the I+1 level, particularly in the language classroom. Now, I've been using the expression specifically written text rather than simplified text, because we've already seen on the course that a specifically written text doesn't necessarily have to be simplified. Earlier in the course, we looked at the course book New Business Matters by Mark Powell and other people. And we saw that there they had enhanced, that's their word, they had enhanced the original authentic text to include a lot more lexis. This was the main focus of the book, focusing, it was a lexical approach book, focusing on the lexis. So what we've got there, if you like, is the other side of the coin. In a sense, a text which has actually been made more difficult for the learners. Now, I think that if we take the view that text can be used in this way, we can write text specifically for the needs of our language learners, this opens up an awful lot of possibilities. For example, Business Matters is enhancing the text in terms of the lexis. It could also be structures for some levels, particularly lower levels. But it could also be skills. And in fact, that's what I've tried to do in the lesson plan, which you'll see later in this unit, which was working on the spooky stories text that you've been looking at. What I focused on in the lesson sequence that I designed around that text was the sub-skill of inferring non-explicitly stated meaning. And I actually built into the text, which originally is a true story and an authentic story, I built into the text various elements which were implied but not actually stated, so that in my lesson I could actually focus on that particular sub-skill. Personally, I do think there's a big place in the language classroom for specifically written texts. At the lower levels, they're going to avoid the problems of demotivation and frustration, which I think authentic texts often bring with them. At the higher levels, at all levels really, but especially at the higher levels, they are going to allow us to enhance the text with the vocabulary, with the sub-skills, with whatever it is that we want our learners to be focusing on. This of course doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to throw authentic texts out altogether. Of course we're not. We're still going to be using them when they're actually appropriate for the learners and for what we want to teach in that particular lesson. But I think we need both types of texts. It's no longer an either-or choice. It's a matter of what can each of these types of texts contribute to the learner's learning, and how can we use them to the learner's best advantage.